Hello, my name is Father Tighe, and this is segment 21 of our Journey of Faith in the Light of the Cross. And again, in this journey, we take Paul as our guide as we go back to the letter to the Galatians. So we see in our screen here that we have Paul's faith journey in the light of the cross. And we go to our next screen and we see our theme. Our theme is justification through faith in covenant of the promise. The whole segment, the whole law is all about we break the Mosaic law for universal oneness by going back to Abraham, who lived 430 years before Moses. No justification can come through the covenant of law because it segregates the world, whereas the covenant of faith unites the world in oneness. We go on to our first screen and we see how this problem came up in the early Christian community. After the Council of Jerusalem in 49, Peter, Paul, and Barnabas go up to Antioch. And we see in Galatians 2, when Cephas came to Antioch, I confronted him to his face, for he was clearly wrong. Paul is not afraid of anybody, and he goes after Peter something terrible. Until people came from James, he ate with Gentiles. All right, now, it looks like although James and Peter were convinced by Paul at the Council of Jerusalem in 49, afterwards people put pressure on them and they seemed to back away and wither in faith. They were doing it, but they were uncertain about it. And these young Pharisees who were believers in Jesus as the Messiah, but not the Son of God, went after James first in Jerusalem and they said, isn't the Mosaic law absolute and eternal and unchangeable? And can we break it? Of course we can. And James couldn't answer. So he allowed them to go up to Antioch to segregate the community because Paul had been bringing Jew and Gentile, slave and free, and male and female together. And Peter had joined in. But when they came up, when Paul was not around, they went after Peter and they intimidated him just like James, and he broke down in faith. So we see here, he ate with Gentile ethnics, but when they came, he drew back and segregated. See, the Mosaic law segregates the world because he was afraid of the circumcised. He was intimidated by them, and he couldn't answer. He didn't have Paul's education. The rest of the Jews joined in his hypocrisy. Everybody started doing it. So there were two tables in Antioch, the Jewish table and the Gentile table. Even Barnabas, this is Paul's partner, joined in his hypocrisy. But this is very important. But when I saw that they did not walk righteously in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of all, if you, though a Jew, are living like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews? Now, it is very important we look at this. Paul doesn't go after Barnabas, his partner. He goes after Peter. Why? Peter is the symbol of universal oneness. He is the one that brings the church together. And if he breaks down, everything breaks down. So he really goes after him, and he's unafraid to go after him publicly. And he says, if you, though a Jew, are living like a Gentile and not like a Jew, before they came up from Jerusalem, after they intimidated James, then they come up and you break down. I can understand, Peter, you don't have my education. You were not educated as well as I do. I can understand you not being able to explain yourself, but I cannot tolerate you compelling the poor Gentiles to either become Jewish and assimilate into the Jewish table or sit at second class at another table. And why did Paul understand this? Because Paul grew up with this chronic ailment that made him unclean. And when he was unclean, he was segregated. He was isolated. And he felt that isolation and he felt that pain. And he knew what it was to feel like a second-class citizen at another table. And he says, Peter, I can understand you not being able to stand up to them. But I cannot understand you betraying your Gentile brothers and sisters. You were eating with them. And they come up and intimidate you, and you become ashamed of them. And you segregate yourself as if you reject and abandon them. You are the same Peter who did the same thing to Jesus. And so we see in the gospel they emphasize that Peter was the one who was ashamed that Jesus wouldn't fight back. He rejected it and abandoned him. 20 years later, he was the same man. So in all the gospels, they emphasize that Peter was this man. And yet, what's the point? Peter is still the one chosen by Jesus to be the symbol of oneness in the church. Even though he breaks down, he recovers. And now he recovers in Antioch. He repents and he becomes that symbol of oneness despite his weaknesses and faults. And we go on to the next slide and we see Paul says, we are Jews by nature and not sinners from Gentile ethnics. All Jews thought themselves as a wondrous miracle people, born not by the will of the flesh, not by the will of man, but by the will of God. So all Jews in nature are sort of a wondrous people born by the will of God, not like the Gentiles who are born by accident or mistake, or at least they feel that way. Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of law, but through faith. Paul had tried all his life to be the perfect follower and zealous observer of the law. And what did it do to him? It broke him down. It put one curse upon another. Because he had this chronic ailment, he was unclean, and so he ate at a separate table. Because he was unclean, he couldn't marry a woman without making her unclean, or having unclean children, so he couldn't have children. He couldn't be a rabbi. Everything he did, the more he observed the law, the more he felt cursed by the law itself. But then when he surrendered to Jesus Christ, and he joined and preached the gospel to the Gentiles, he was unbound. And all those curses were transformed into blessings. He no longer needed to be married because he had life in the church. He no longer had to be a rabbi because he was teaching a new faith, a new doctrine that brought the world together, and in bringing the world together, brought the best out of him and brought the best out of other people. Now we go back. We have believed in Christ Jesus that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law. The law never brought unity, nor life, nor love. For by works of the law, no one will be justified. And now we go on to our next screen. And we see that if in seeking to be justified in Christ, we ourselves are found to be sinners, Paul says, yes, we are breaking out of the cultural laws of the Mosaic law. Is Christ then a minister, a deacon of sin? I should have had a question mark there. Deacon is really the word for minister. So it's a servant. Is Christ then a servant of sin? Of course not. But if I now rebuild those things I tore down, then I show myself as a transgressor. Notice the difference. When I break a law, I'm a transgressor. When I break the law of God's life-giving love, I sin. Sin is much more serious than transgressing a law, a cultural law. For through the law I died to the law, that I might live for God. I have been co-crucified with Christ. I tried all my life to live the law, and I died to its possibility of human effort. But now I have been co-crucified with Christ. This is very important. Paul has not been crucified yet, but he identifies Christ because to sit down at a table with Gentiles, he had to crucify everything he had ever been taught. He had to crucify his feelings and his fears that if he ate with Gentiles, he'd actually get poisoned. Remember the Samaritan woman said to Jesus, "You're going to drink from my cup?" But Paul, in a cold sweat, sat down at a table with Gentiles, and he felt the fullness of God's love came out of him. He was released from all those bound up feelings. His talents came out, and he was able to see them as gifts, life-giving gifts to him. I live no longer by myself, but Christ lives in me. I live by faith in the Son of God who has loved me and has given himself up for me. I do not nullify the grace of God. If justification comes through law, then Christ died for nothing. And this makes me think of that hymn we've been singing in church. We must cross the barren desert. Paul is leading the Jewish believers across a barren desert.
But you shall not die of thirst. You shall wander far in safety, though you do not know.
We do not know the way. We don't know where God's leading us. You shall speak foreign words. People will understand what we're talking about. For the face of God will bring us together. Sing with me now, okay? Be not afraid. I go before you always. Come, follow me, and God will give us rest. When we come together and reach out to one another and extend our hands and hearts to one another, it all fits together, and our lives fit together. Thank you for joining us in this 21st segment. I hope you continue to make our journey of faith with us.